Hello, welcome back to another video. This week I wanted to experiment with a vlog of a day spent on a pet portrait of a friend's dog and break down in my digital process. Think of it as a day in the life of an illustrator with some art tips and style study explanations thrown in. Let's get started. I began my day with traditional warm-ups from reference in a sketchbook I'm working on finishing. I started the sketchbook years ago, but I just recently found it again and decided to finish it. I'm someone who's guilty of having multiple unfinished sketchbooks, but I'm slowly making my way through all of them. This one has priority because it only has a handful of pages left, and it's also a nice size. I've been working in a 6x8 inch or roughly A5 size sketchbook, so this 9x12, which is between an A4 and an A3, paper felt huge. Smaller sketchbooks are obviously more portable, but I actually prefer larger sketchbooks. Maybe it's from my background of drawing on loose leaf paper. As for other supplies, I used a mechanical pencil with blue lead for the undersketch and then a 2B pencil to draw in the finished lines. I'm also working on finishing this colored lead, by the way. The colors are fun and I love drawing in graphite, but the transfer between pages is annoying. These days, I tend to use pen in sketchbooks to avoid this. Anyway, I thought I'd talk a little bit about why I do warm-ups as the rest of this footage plays out. I didn't used to do warm-ups because I didn't see a point in them until later on when I started taking art seriously again several years ago. Warming up allows me to sharpen my observational skills and slowly build up line confidence. My first sketches involve a lot of erasing and hesitant lines as my hand gets reacquainted with drawing motions. You can see that by the last sketch, I was confident enough to forego the blue undersketch. This sketch took the least amount of time, but it ended up being one of my favorites because I had hit my flow state. I noticed that on the days I warm up, I end up doing better quality work for my finished concepts and illustrations. It's like stretching before running. Giving your creative muscles time to warm up leads to a better art session overall. The next part is optional and not something I do every day. Digital warm-ups serve the same purpose as traditional warm-ups for me, but with the added bonus of getting used to the disconnect between the stylus and the screen. This was extra important back when I used to use the Wacom Intuos, which doesn't have a screen. These days, however, I use either a Cintiq or my iPad for work. My iPad and the Apple Pencil are the best tools I've ever used at mimicking the feel of traditional art, but there's still a noticeable difference between them and an actual sheet of paper and pencil. In terms of programs, I use Procreate for all my iPad paintings and designs. It was the first software I used when I got my iPad back in 2018, and while it isn't as powerful as Photoshop, I much prefer the interface and brush engine. There's still a tiny lag between where I put the pen tip and where the brush mark appears on the canvas, but it's much smaller than any other program I've used. No matter what program I use, however, I usually work with 1 or 2 layers for my warm-up sketches. These are the equivalent to the traditional undersketch and final lines. Like my traditional sketches, I focus on big overall shapes like the mass of the skull and the muzzle first. It's much easier to get lost in tiny details digitally because you can just keep on zooming in. I try to mitigate this issue by keeping my reference images small, so that I have no choice but to work on the big proportions first. As for brushes, I tend to switch between several when doing digital line art, but I've linked the one I use the most often below. I prefer brushes that have a little tooth to them and little to no variation in opacity. After a cup of tea, I moved on to the day's main focus. I've had a pet portrait sketch sitting in my work in progress folder for months. This is my friend's golden retriever, who is a very good boy, by the way. After finalizing the lines, I quickly blocked in colors and then started trying out different lighting setups. The original photo has indoor top-down lighting, but I wanted to place him in a sunny field in late afternoon. I was tempted to go with rim lighting, but ultimately decided to cast half of him in shadow. This helped show the forms of his face better, and worked well as a value setup for my style study. You may have noticed from my other videos that I tend to render to a smooth polish that de-emphasizes brush strokes, especially in my digital work. When there is texture, it resembles color pencil or graphite, probably because those were the mediums I first learned how to render in. My goal this day was to study and incorporate John Singer Sargent's style into this pet portrait. Sargent was an American painter best known for his expressive portraits, but also painted landscapes and other subjects in both oils and watercolor. Sargent's paintings are known for bold, loose brushstrokes and strong value compositions, where dark and light help draw the viewer's eye to the focal point. He concentrates detail in the focal point and lets other details fade away into almost abstract brushstrokes. I have always been drawn to the confidence in his style, and I wondered if I could try to capture some of that in a distinctly modern media. I started with the face, but quickly found myself tunnel visioning into minute details like the brows and transitions between the head and ears. I had a smaller version of the canvas open to one side as a reference image, and when I looked up, I realized I had barely done anything at all. I decided to focus on the background instead for 2 reasons. 1, I needed to step away from the focal point so I could come back with fresh eyes later, and 2, working on something that had to be abstract would force me to work large to small. The first several layers felt alternately too busy or too simple, as I tried out a variety of brush sizes. Once I slowed down and started placing strokes deliberately, however, things started to look up. I increased my brush size and turned on a little bit of hue jitter to add color variation without affecting the values too much. I found that layering light over dark gave some of the best results. The dark mimics naturally occurring shadows, while the light gives the impression of detailed clumps of grass. I used a similar technique for the fur later. When analyzing Sargent's work, I noticed there were clean edges mixed in with the looser brush strokes of his backgrounds. I usually blend soft transitions with a smudge tool set to a pastel brush, but I found myself using that technique less and less as I got the hang of layering values to create transitions. I appreciated the way the underlying layer would peek through the edges of the brush strokes, much like layers of oil paint on a canvas. One thing I needed to preserve from the original photo was the perspective. We're looking down at the dog, and the horizon line is above the top edge of the canvas, so everything in the scene is seen from above. I tried to hint at the idea of a field of grass moving away in space by lightening the contrast as I moved closer to the top of the canvas and making the strips of darker grass thinner, as though they were being viewed from farther away. The highest contrast is right at the dog's feet along the edge of his cast shadow. Value contrast and detail here does a lot of the heavy lifting that shows viewers this is grass made out of smaller clumps and strands. Sargent also does this in his work. The grass in the light or shadow here has a relatively uniform value, while the blades along the transition are indicated with vertical strokes in different hues. As a side note, concentrating details along transition points also works well in the design of both characters and environments. Feeling a bit more confident, I took another shot at the main subject of the painting. This time, I kept a careful eye on the small reference view so that overall forms and values took precedence over details. A tip I learned for painting fur is to pay attention to the direction of overall clumps of fur. This is dictated by how the coat grows, but also by the underlying forms underneath. It's tempting when trying to emulate loose or even impressionistic styles to shove paint around with wild abandon on either a physical or digital canvas, but that isn't usually effective. I found that in reality, painting this way actually requires more deliberate thought and intention when placing strokes to efficiently describe form without over-rendering. For this piece, I tried to capture what I thought of as waves of fur along the ruff, chest, and back. Waves have volume and direction despite being made out of individual water droplets. I first grouped the wave with 1 or 2 values, then defined the transitions between waves with lighter and darker strokes, showing how they overlapped or crashed against each other like on the chest. After this pass, I focused in on the collar and tag. I wanted the tag and ring to read as metal, so I drew in ellipses and locked the transparency of those layers. This let me brush in highlights and shadows without having to worry about staying inside the lines. Another quick tip. Shiny metal looks like metal because of the high contrast in values and the wide value range from very dark to very light. Don't be afraid to put bright highlights next to deep darks on metallic objects. Unfortunately for me, this made this area stand out too much compared to the rest of the painting. I decided to look at how Sargent tackled accessories that required some attention but shouldn't steal the show from the focal point. He kept his brush strokes loose, but gave clear indications of highlights or shadows. I unlocked the transparency and merged a layer with the rest of the painting before going in with the brush I had used for the fur to soften those clean edges. I wanted the tag to look like something that was part of the scene, not an object pasted on top. After painting in shadows and some tufts of fur on top, I decided to tone down the values even more, and this finally brought things together. Moving on to the focal point, I could see now that I had two major issues. One, there wasn't enough contrast in this area, so it felt flat compared to everything else. Two, there wasn't enough painterly texture, especially along the cheeks and muzzle. Everything was too smooth and even. It looked like it had been airbrushed, not painted using oils. I tackled both of these issues at once. Adding bright highlights where sunlight would catch on individual fur strands felt satisfying and immediately added dimension to the face. I then selected the deepest shadows in the piece, which happened to be a dark red hue, and added them to the side of the face in shadow, especially along the border between shadow and light. This defined plane changes like the edge of the eye socket and the transition between the forehead to the muzzle. As for the texture problems, these were solved by doing all of this with a large brush and deliberate strokes. Normally, I tend to work from large brushes to small brushes, but this time I refused to let myself go small. I had to consider each stroke before I placed it, which was nerve-wracking at first, but eventually became a meditative exercise. I was still keeping fur direction in mind, but was also shifting the value and hue a little each time to express small nuances like the dimple in the corner of the mouth and the space beneath the eye. Perhaps the hardest part of a painting is deciding when it's finished. I chose to step back at this point and get a snack. Remember to take breaks when painting or drawing. Your body and your mind will thank you. When I came back, I immediately realized I needed more value contrast between the light and dark sides of the subject. This is done easily in digital media by adding a multiplied layer on top of the painting and keeping it confined to only the parts you want to be darker. I wanted some of the fur texture to show through, but for it to overall feel more unified, so that the viewer wouldn't be distracted away from the face. This also gave me an opportunity to separate the subject from the background. Another trick I learned from Sargent. I noticed in many of his portraits that he emphasizes the focal point by adding strategic shadows around it to create a stronger silhouette. Of course, other less important areas will fade away into softer transitions, and I did this around the grass by the dog's legs. After the last overlay layer to punch up the brightest highlights, I was done. And that's a day in my life and also an inside look at how I study art and style. Master studies that are copies of existing work obviously have tremendous value, but sometimes it could be more interesting and challenging to analyze a style and then transpose it onto your own work. Do I think this is a perfect copy of Sargent's style? No, definitely not. But it was a great way for me to study while also working on a gift for a friend, and I learned a lot along the way. I hope to incorporate some of the things I learned into future pieces, but for now, that's all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week with another video. Bye!